Deep Voice Show. And today we have our guest, David Goa. He is a writer on religion and modern life. David Goa, please introduce yourself.
Hello, Derek. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome back to our show, David Goa. And today we'll be talking about religious extremism and what are the roots for religious extremism and fanaticism, and what is the ultimate goal or the healthy goal of religion, if any, and what is really the purpose of faith in the modern age, and what causes people to become extremists.
When we think about extremists, we have to be careful.
Mm-hmm.
There's been many forms of extremism in human history.
And not all of them are religious.
Not all of them are religious. We have extremists who hold various kinds of ideology. In the 19th century in Russia, there was a period of time where you had people who were socialists and Marx, the beginnings of Marxism.
Yep.
And other forms of utopian thinking,
Mm-hmm.
many of whom were atheist, and there was a whole period of time in which there was a kind of deep nihilism, a deep sense of meaninglessness that crept into the lives of people. And many of these people then engaged in violent acts, sometimes in acts that also led to their own death.
Yes, and also I've studied the history books where it's actually organized nihilist movements, which kind of seems like a contradiction in terms, like organized anarchist party or organized nihilist party, but each
Well, everybody needs to organize, even if they pretend they don't. I mean, we live in a period now when we hear an awful lot about various kinds of violent acts in the name of religion. This whole idea of suicide bombers, which we hear about, the first serious manifestation of this, it's a bit of a surprise to people to realize it, which actually was the largest group that was engaged in that, actually was in Sri Lanka.
Okay.
And was associated with the war in Sri Lanka that took place between the Sinhalese and between the Buddhist and Hindu communities in Sri Lanka. It was a bitter war. It only was resolved quite recently. But at a certain point, here up to a decade ago, that war became extremely bitter, and there were groups who decided that the only way they could get the attention of the West, they felt they needed the attention of the West to resolve their issues in their favor. The only way they could do that was by making things impossible for people in the West to stomach. So one of the things they did was they began to engage in suicide bombing, and sometimes using children as well. And that gets into the news media, it gets the attention of the West, and they saw that as their last desperate act. But I'm very curious as to what that pathway is that leads somebody to become convinced that there is nothing to live for.
Yep.
Become convinced that all they can have is something to die for.
Yep.
That, it seems to me, requires that you have either given up on an awful lot in life, or that you have some kind of utopian view, and maybe even a view that indicates that in the next life you will somehow achieve something.
That would explain the religious fanatic, but to explain the atheist suicide bomber, be motivated by a utopian dream, or at least revenge, or to harm someone else.
Sure, and that through doing this was the case in Sri Lanka, through doing this, their hopes for a better society would finally come about because the pressure would be on the West to either stop supporting or begin to support another party and help this get resolved. So people can give their life without any sense of an afterlife, obviously, and can do it simply because they have become so disillusioned, but also convinced that this is the last thing they can do, the very last thing they can do.
But backtracking a bit, if one looks at the Renaissance, the 30 Years' War, if I remember correctly, 1/3 of the population was wiped out. And I remember reading a book on the Lancastrian mercenaries of Germany, and they really didn't have much of an option. Their political climate during that particular time, there was a saying in that particular time, the third born. The third born were basically the third, fourth, fifth, or sixth sons born into a family. But the problem was, due to some of the laws and some of the civil laws and the guild laws, there's only so many jobs to go around, and the Catholic Church encouraged large families. So you had these large families with large numbers of sons that had no prospect of employment. The first two sons would get employment, the rest would be just unemployed layabouts. And each Sunday they would train doing the pike formations and, learn how to use the Swyander, the crossbow, the arquebus gun. And basically it was almost like a circus. Usually a baron or a duke would get a license to raise an army, and basically these unemployed men would hang around.
Well, that's not unlike today.
Yeah.
I mean, the unemployment rates, if you look at the demographics, virtually all the countries in the Near East,
Yep.
they have huge young population.
That's
The process of industrialization has not brought them much at all. There's poverty and little opportunities for employment. So all of those things exist in a similar manner. But there's nothing natural about that.
Right.
That is a society developing in a warped way.
Yep.
So you end up with a lot of the resources and the power in the society resting in very few hands.
Yep.
And the possibilities for living a meaningful life and having a family and taking care of each other just becomes limited.
Yep.
So then you're vulnerable to this, and there's a sense in which it looks inevitable because there's no other game in town, but it obviously isn't inevitable. It's a result of a pile of decisions that are made. It's a result of a skewed economy,
Yep.
and of not taking seriously what it means to make our life together in the world, and to do it with some regard for all of nature, and some regard for our friends and neighbors, and some regard for our enemies. So it's dangerous, it seems to me, to think it's kind of natural. It's not natural. It's a tragedy. It's an unbelievable tragedy.
Yeah, and if one really meditates on traditional tribal societies, I don't think it would be bogged down by, are you a capitalist or are you a socialist? I mean, a tribal society, you'd become the best hunter you could become. You'd become maybe the best housewife as you could become. And if you had surplus furs or surplus jackets or clothing, you would simply give it to your fellow human being of your tribe. And the tribe itself, your leaders, you would know who your leader is. It would be a meritocracy. You would select the best among you to lead. And it wouldn't be this far distant leader or this royalty. It would have been a close-knit community. And everything you can look at that, let's say you take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you're building up the needs and you're also building up, I mean, you got your basic needs, then you got your social needs.
Well, you point to an important thing, which is the whole question of belonging.
Yep.
And, you know, I've been doing some work in the prisons with people who have gotten involved in some of these things. And the issue of belonging is obviously a really important one. And traditional societies,
Yep.
tribal societies, have pretty tight kinship relationships. And the belonging is simply self-evident there.
Yes.
Belonging isn't self-evident in our society.
No.
You've got to will your relationships in our society.
Yes.
Even intimate relationships in our society tend to be terribly fragile.
Yes.
So this question of belonging is a very important one, and when you go through these huge transitions from something remotely like a traditional society, in some cases a traditional society, into the modern world, that's why I talked about it as being so painful. It's a huge painful thing, and maybe you put your finger on the key thing, which is that it disrupts all one's sense of belonging. So.
That I agree with. So, I mean, the solution would be, you would say, I think we would be both in agreement, to overcome this problem of religious extremism, to develop a deeper faith and a more complete community.
Yeah, the term religious extremism is a very curious word to me, because if you take the intellectual architects of religious extremism in whatever faith tradition we find them, and if you study those intellectual architects of religious extremism, what you find is that they have an extremely narrow set of religious preoccupations.
Yes.
And of religious ideas. They have not drunk at the ocean of the spiritual life.
Yep.
They do not represent the religious tradition in anything like a rich way.
Yep.
So I talk about the antidote to that kind of approach being what I call deep religion. That is, you need to have your roots going deep within the tradition.
Yes.
And draw forth the gifts that are there. Because all religious traditions are oceans of meaning.
Yep.
And all of them have built-in ways of countering human illusion,
Yep.
particularly spiritual illusion.
Okay.
And those need to be made available. Here in Canada, I've been told by some of the people that I've worked with in prison that the formation of many young people that they're experiencing at home is that their parents, if their parents, you know, some of these people were immigrants, some are natural born, but the concern was that you be pious and pray. But they've also said that there was never any teaching in the home about the faith, or there wasn't much reading of books or anything like that about the faith. So you've got a kind of piety, a kind of simple piety that's there without much knowledge or teaching taking place. And then on the other hand, the young people are encouraged to go to university, to get a good job and make money and have a position. So one of the people that I've been spending time talking with has described this as a kind of spiritual schizophrenia.
Really?
You know,
be spiritual, but don't understand why you're spiritual.
That's right. You do it out of piety, and he also talked about the contradiction between those. Because if your concern for others, your concern for your neighbor, your concern for God is much greater than your concern for success or for money. So I said to this person at the same time, well, you know, this is very similar for Christians these days. because there are relatively few Christians in this society, Christian families, where there's any kind of real knowledge about the faith
Yep.
and any kind of teaching about it. So that's also, I think, one of the challenges of our particular kind of modernity. Nihilism, a sense of meaninglessness, is an extremely dangerous psychological condition.
Yes.
Because when you get into a state of nihilism, of that kind of despair, you then may look for something that I would say is totalizing to fill that hole. Something that gives you purpose, something that gives you work, something that gives you a reason to die, that can fill that hole, even if it just fills it briefly.
That would make a lot of sense. You give yourself the meaning, and you project your suffering onto something else, and thus give yourself meaning.
Right.
And you're fighting for meaning, but to the nihilist, or to many of these individuals, it seems to be a very last-ditch, lastful, grabbing at straws approach to finding meaning.
Right.
And
Now, and we can see that, but we have to be careful here too. You know, we've had lots of people from Canada go over to ISIS, probably a couple hundred anyways, and I had a look at their educational backgrounds, and wasn't entirely surprising. I had a sense this would be the case. About all of them, virtually all of them, went through the Canadian public school system. 70% of them went to Canadian universities. 20% of them have 2 degrees.
that's,
So here we're looking at people that go over because they have decent educations, they're not poor,
yep,
families reasonably stable. Now there are some examples of, among some of them had gotten involved in drugs and a kind of despoiled sex life and things of that nature. A few of them, that was the case, and they wanted petty criminal behavior, and so they saw a chance to redeem themselves from all of that. Now there's a few things that are important about this.
actually, with drug taking, some of that behavior could simply be they're trying to fill in a void or trying to escape hating their lives.
Of course. I mean, you can do that through many means, and that's one means. You can also do it by joining a movement,
Yep.
becoming part of the motorcycle gang. You know, what would appear to be the case is that there was a relatively little sense of belonging within this society. That is, even those that had stable families and what have you, certainly hadn't bonded with the civil aspects of Canadian society. So one of the things that was striking to me is when you look at what our education has done in the last 40, 50 years, most of our education, including in universities, is about learning to critique culture, critique the civil society, critique imperialism, critique all of these things. Now, critique is an important part of education.
Okay.
But it is interesting to see that if these students had only gotten the critique and they had never gotten any kind of education into the gifts of the West,
Yep.
into the gifts of civil society, into the gifts of the rule of law, I began to wonder if we haven't made a real contribution to them walking down that path through the educational system itself. Now, this is one group. If you look at those that have gone to join, from Kosovo, for example, there's a lot that have gone from Kosovo and former Yugoslavia, from various countries in the Near East, Indonesia, what have you. I'm read that many of them go because there's no other game in town.
Really?
They are poor, to use a phrase of Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, Thomas Friedman said, most of those young men, they're mostly men, have never held a job, have never held power, and have never held a girl's hand. And he said ISIS offered them a girl's hand, a wife. ISIS offers them a job, they get paid, and ISIS offers them income. They're paid every month. So we see something different there, but there's another element to it. I don't think we should overlook it. And that's this nostalgia, at least that's how I would put it, the nostalgia for an empire. That kind of nostalgia can exist everywhere. But there's a lot of that among a certain portion of the Near East, in Iraq, in Syria, because that part of the world was deeply harmed by the arrangements which were made, the national boundaries which were drawn at the end of the First World War. Those were drawn willy-nilly by the West. And so it destroyed tribal connections, it destroyed natural forms of leadership. We see something like that as having happened here with the indigenous people of Canada.
Yep.
The destruction of the capacity to live off the land, of natural leadership forms and what have you. So you put all that in the mix, and then you add this other big thing, which is many of those communities are being drugged, kicking and screaming into the modern world.
Yep.
And the modern world, which I think has gifts, I don't discount those gifts, but the modern world's hard. If you have been raised in tight kinship groups,
Yep.
Where you've extended families, where the social service system is really your family, you take care of each other and everybody in the village pitches in. And as you enter the modern world, all of that changes. The modern world, the modern industrial and post-industrial world, gives you a whole different sense of time and how time is organized. It organizes space differently. The nature of cities and all of that is entirely different. It completely challenges natural kinship groups. It changes the notion of family. It changes the notion of authority profoundly. All of these things occur. So there's a deep, that can bring with it what many scholars have called a deep malaise. The malaise of modernity.
Yep.
The uneasiness with the modern world. Now again, if we think of Europe, where our kind of the modern world actually has its roots, the process of becoming modern in this sense is a very serious, at least 300-year process.
Yes.
And it really begins 500 years ago. It begins in part with the Reformation, with a heightened sense of the individual, with throwing off the Holy Roman Empire, with the development of the nation state,
Yep.
with a new sense of autonomous authority. All of this lays the groundwork for that. So when we look at Europe and this process of becoming modern, we see it's enormously painful. Enormous number of wars, enormous number of struggles, and in some ways Charles Dickens describes this in his novels about England. He describes how painful it was. So when I look at this horrific sacrifice of life
Yep.
that is being made by so many young people, it's heartbreaking, because one can readily see that all of these forces have co-joined.
Yep.
And there are people that no longer see any other alternative but self-destruction and taking whoever they can with them. So my sense is, in some cases there's a kind of utopian dream that's at work. There's a deep sense of malaise that comes about, a kind of nostalgia for something in the past, perhaps. And also,
Looking forward or looking back to a golden age and trying to recreate
Sure.
it.
and also a deep sense of nihilism. So those exist in different mixtures, in different people, and in different moments, in different places in time. And the real task that I think is before us, because I'm afraid that this is going to be something that is with us for the next 50 years. The big task before us is how does one address and not contribute to that?
Yep.
And my sense, just in conclusion, is that there are two big things that need to be done. The first one is people who are religious, whether they're Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, people who are religious need to be given a deep religion.
Okay.
That is, their religious understanding and knowledge needs to be deepened.
Okay.
Because a deep sense of your faith and some deep understanding of it never leads to death dealing.
Okay.
A deep sense of your faith will always lead you to a deeper sense of gratitude, to a deeper sense of the wonder of life, to less fear, less desire, and more capacity to engage others. And the second thing that needs to be done is we need to teach people the gifts of civil society, as modest and inefficient as they may be. Democracy is a blunt tool.
Yes.
Nobody ever gets their own will, but that's its gift. So we need to teach people about the civil society we live in as well, and what its gifts are and what its limitations are. So both those things need to be worked at, it seems to me, for the next generations to have some chance of not walking down that road.